All right, so we've been talking about this whole idea of fighting the fight of faith, right? How do you know if you're fighting the fight of faith? How would you determine if you were fighting the fight of faith? What does that look like? We could tell that Daniel was fighting the fight of faith because, why? What did we see? Yeah, see, fighting the fight of faith has to do with standing on the truths of God's word. So when we look at Daniel, we see that he believed things like through the nation of Israel, all would be blessed. Or he believed things like God had said that Babylon was going to destroy Jerusalem, and so when Babylon did, he saw that and he said, yep, that's the way that is. He believed that God was omniscient and that he was the giving God who gives to those that are wise, and that God sets up kings and God puts down kings, right? I mean, we can go through Daniel and we can see specific things that he believed, right? Those things then affected the way that he lived. You probably heard, there's often a debate about James, because James says faith without works is dead, and people get all caught up in that. But it's really simple if you understand what faith is, because if you believe something to be true, right, it affects the way that you live. But it has to be about believing something specific, right? If it's just like, well, I just believe, well, that's not going to do anything for you. But if you believe, for example, that eating this food will defile you, right, like Daniel did, then you won't eat the food, right? That's the work, you could say, that's produced by the faith. But the work isn't good enough by itself. You got to have the faith to produce it. There is a method. There's a how. It's not about just doing the right thing. It's about believing the right thing and allowing your faith to produce that. Does that make sense? Okay. Tonight, we're going to talk about another character, and we're going to look at what does it look like to not walk by faith. And as we talk about this a little bit, it's important to recognize that we are not contrasting good versus evil. As I mentioned on Monday night, when I tell you who this is, you're probably going to be shocked, but we're not contrasting good versus evil. We're not saying that this person is a bad person, so to speak. What we're doing is we're contrasting fighting the fight of faith versus not fighting the fight of faith. You could live a pretty good life without fighting the fight of faith. Mormons do it. Jehovah's Witnesses do it. You can live a good life. You can have a good family. You can have a good wife. You can have a good husband. You can have good kids. You can do well at work. You can be respectful to people. In other words, you can just live a good life and totally be separated from faith. In fact, there's going to be all kinds of people who live that kind of life, stand before the Lord and find out that they're not even believers, right? And so living a good life is something different than fighting the fight of faith. But just because you're not fighting the fight of faith doesn't mean suddenly that you're an evil person, okay? And so the person that we look like that tonight, we're not necessarily saying that they are evil in that way. Let me ask you this, too. How many of you would agree with this statement, that grace is something that is undeserved? Would you agree with that? Grace is something that's undeserved? You pretty much have to. That's the definition of grace. So grace is undeserved. Grace is something that is undeserved. What that then means, if you then begin to flesh that out, is that just because you see grace in someone's life, that is not a stamp of approval on their life. In fact, if you said that, then you would be disagreeing with the definition that you just agreed with. Like God only puts grace on people's life who he gives a stamp of approval. That then means that you got to get the stamp of approval to get grace, and that would not be undeserved. But you just told me that grace is undeserved favor. So something that is undeserved means that we should see it not only in lives like David, who definitely didn't deserve it, right, but is called a man after God's own heart, but also in lives like Samson. We should see grace in his life as well. We should see grace on both the unjust and the just. In fact, all throughout Scripture, if you read much of the Old Testament, you find out that God's grace is unbelievable. Think about his grace towards Nineveh, right? Who he not only sends Jonah, but then later again, about 150 years later, he sends another prophet to them about 10 years before he destroys them, because he is trying to draw them to himself. The grace is poured out even on the wicked, you see? All right? And so God is gracious. What I mean by that is this, is that if you came down here to Freedom and you said, wow, the missionaries of Freedom, look at all that God's doing, they must have a great walk with the Lord. See, now you're attributing that God's works are connected to the things that we are doing, right? I mean, God is a great God. He does what he does. He pours out grace. That's totally independent of whether the missionaries here have good walks or not. Does that make sense? Okay, our walk does not merit this. His favor, in other words, okay? It's really important to see grace that way. I think it's difficult to see it that way because we typically always want to slip in that measure of works, okay? But as we look at this character, you're going to be able to say, but God showed grace in their life. And I'm going to say, yeah, but that's not necessarily a stamp of approval. That says something about God. That doesn't necessarily say something about this particular person. Okay? So, does this make sense? Are you ready? Okay, so tonight, we're going to look a little bit at the book of Esther. So if you want to turn to Esther, and you can go to chapter 2, that's where we're going to start. Okay, Esther chapter 2. Remember that the books of the Bible are literature. Okay, they're literature. They're inspired by the Holy Spirit, but they are literature. In other words, they have genre. Okay, the way that they're written is important. I know sometimes we don't think about that, but the way that a book is written is important. For example, Psalms is poetry, right? And you should interpret it as poetry. You've got history books. You know, you've got Gospels, you've got Apocalyptic, you've got prophecy, you've got all kinds of different books in Scripture. And Esther is unique in the way that it is written. Does anybody know what makes Esther unique?
It's the only one that doesn't mention God.
That's right. It's the only book that doesn't mention God. Imagine the Holy Spirit inspired this book, and God is never mentioned. But you know, God is not the only one that's never mentioned. Also in this book, you'll never see the word praise. You'll never see the word prayer. You'll never see the word worship. You'll never see the word law, covenant, temple. In fact, there's one point where it almost seems like you get a little bit of a slap if you're really reading it and understanding what's going on, because Esther says, fast for me. And it's strange because the normal sort of rubric, when that is used in Scripture, whenever we hear fasting in Scripture, normally you hear fast and pray. Fast and pray. It's linked to prayer. You can see pray by itself, but you don't usually see fasting by itself if we're talking about asking somebody to do it for us. You usually see fast and pray. But in this case, the Holy Spirit inspired just the word fast. And so we don't see pray. It seems very strange that that's not there. What is there is in 167 verses, 250 times you will see Xerxes, king, Persia. Xerxes, king, or Persia are used 250 times in 167 verses. What this tells us then is that it's like the world is everywhere kind of a thing, right? The world is everywhere, and God is somewhat hidden. All right? Now, you're going to look through this book, and you're going to see, man, God is everywhere in this book. He definitely is. But the idea behind the way that it was written suggests that, listen, God was not there at the forefront. He's working behind the scenes kind of a thing. We don't see him overtly the way that we do in other books. All right? This is an idea of looking really at the world is everywhere. In fact, when we get started here, we're going to start in chapter 2, because chapter 1 is all about a big party that Xerxes threw for himself. In fact, it was a 6-month-long party. So the whole first chapter kind of puts this emphasis on Xerxes is this big, amazing guy, you know, hugely powerful, famous throughout the world, right? That's chapter 1. Now, to set this in context a little bit, we are probably about 50 years between Daniel and Esther, okay? Which makes them good for comparison's sake, because both Daniel and Esther were about the same age when we start to hear their story. Neither Daniel nor Esther were prophets or priests. They were just public servants. You know, both of them, you could say, were involved in politics, I guess. You know, Esther's a queen. You know, Daniel's second in command in 2 different kingdoms, right? So they don't have like the godly job or anything like that, right? The sacred job. Of course, there is no such thing. Instead, they both are involved in the secular type of a world, which I say that in quotes because, of course, everything is meant to be done for God's glory. But Esther would have known about Daniel. There's just no way. She's queen of the Persian kingdom. All right. In other words, Darius was also king of Persia. Okay. Darius is the one who threw Daniel into the lion's den. So we're only talking about 50 years ago that this stuff happened. You know, and Daniel had been in power for something like 70 years. Okay. And so there's just no way she didn't hear the stories of Daniel. She probably would have grown up hearing some of these stories. Okay, some of these stories of Daniel. Well, let's look in chapter 2 and start reading in verse 5. And there are some really incredible things that are written here, but some of them, they come across very matter of fact. So we'll talk through them in just a second. Now there was in the citadel Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Do you remember we talked about that yesterday? That was the whole, Monday night, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hands of Babylon. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into the king, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem in the care of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. All right, so here's the setting. 50 years earlier, they had been allowed to return to Jerusalem. Okay, Cyrus had given the order, you can go back to Jerusalem. And you know, only 50,000 people had returned, which means that the rest of them stayed behind in exile. So Mordecai stays behind, Esther stays behind. And you know, both Jeremiah and Isaiah had told them that after 70 years, they should come out of exile. They should come back to the land. Okay? And so we kind of get a start on this in this book with the sense that they aren't really taking hold of the promises. They're there in exile when they don't need to be. You know, for a Jewish person, the land was the promise. You know? And when they had been driven out of the land, they clearly saw that because they were complaining. They were saying, God deserted us. Look, he's driven us out of the land, right? But then, after that generation passes away, a new generation comes along. And they were like, this is home. Exile is home. And so they stayed there in exile. Now, that's not necessarily a slam dunk case, but that begins to say, wait a second, Jews in captivity is abnormal. But it become normal. They were meant to live in the promised land, and they were living far from it. But it also appears that there's some compromise that's happening here. For example, Mordecai wants her to keep her identity a secret, and she agrees. She keeps her identity a secret. Okay? Now, what that would mean is that, do you remember how Daniel was offered food and drink? And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. That would defile me. Well, we're told, just very matter-of-factly, as we read that she ate the king's food and drank the king's drink. In other words, she drank what was given to her. She couldn't say no, because if she said no, they would know that she was a Jew and she was hiding her Judaism. But not only would she have done that, she wouldn't have observed any Sabbaths. She wouldn't have observed any festivals, any feast days, because she was hiding her identity. So where Daniel says, wait a second, I can't do that because that would defile me, right? And he lived his life that way, okay? Esther did not. She chose to go ahead and immerse herself there against what she would have known from her Judaism, right? And so you remember when we get to Darius, Daniel is guilty of something. He's guilty of being a God worshiper, right? Esther would have never been convicted of being a God worshiper. Nobody knew. It was through the Jewish people that all nations were to be blessed. And yet she kept that identity hidden. That seems to indicate compromise. Also, when you go through Daniel, you'll see this. And the Lord caused the king to show favor. And the Lord caused the captain of the guards to show favor. And the Lord caused the chief eunuch to show favor. You'll see those different kinds of things. Okay? Here you see 3 times, and Esther won his favor, and Esther won his favor, and Esther won his favor. Seems to stand out as something that, hey, she was pursuing this. In other words, it's not something that was just against her will. I think sometimes people want to give Esther the benefit of the doubt, and they say, oh yeah, she didn't actually want to be there. And yet she's winning their favor, and she's trying to. She actually even asked the chief eunuch, what should I do in this situation? What should I bring to the king? Morally, this wasn't just a beauty contest, right? Okay, I mean, she would have entered a virgin, she would have left a concubine, she was taken into another house, afterwards. She couldn't stay with the ones that she was with previously, so she goes to Shazgaz, the eunuch that is in charge of the concubines, right? Maybe never to return to the king again, unless summoned, okay? And so, this is not just a beauty contest, but what makes this worse is Mordecai goes to Caesar every day. And it takes a whole year for this to happen. So for an entire year, both she and Mordecai knows what's coming, and nobody stands up and says, hey, we got to put a stop to this. Now listen, again, I'm not trying to say Esther's a bad person. I'm just saying that, listen, there are some gaps between what she believed and the way she lived her life. And the reason is because she wasn't placing her faith in the truths that she knew. Right? Now you might say, but you got to understand, if she didn't do that, she would have never become queen. Well, first of all, just understand that argument is nothing but compromise. But secondly, seriously? Did we just see what happened with Daniel twice? He's elevated to second in command in the kingdom twice. You don't think it's possible that God could have placed Esther in her position as queen without the immorality? Without the compromise? Like God needed the compromise and the immorality in order to get her into the position. Is that what we're saying? I think if we think about this and we just boil this down, there are 3 main things that she missed out on. Being Jewish was to be God's chosen people. It was an opportunity to proclaim His glory and exalt His name. But they compromised that opportunity by hiding her identity. The second thing is that it doesn't appear that she had any desire to make a long-term difference. All right? We see both Darius, most likely, and Nebuchadnezzar come to a knowledge of God through Daniel's walk of faith. We don't see that with Xerxes. It looks like she just really existed to make him happy. Esther wasn't looking to bring some sort of eternal benefit to Xerxes. And then this last thing, the third thing, would be a quote from Caroline James. She says, God made Esther beautiful, but that gift, like any other, came with the responsibility to use it in ways that honor Him. Her loss in this respect is that she forgot she was Hadassah, a daughter of the covenant, a descendant of Abraham and Sarah, and God's image bearer. She lost her true identity when she made beauty her business. Her purpose slipped from pleasing God to making Xerxes happy whenever he happened to send for her. According to God's blueprint for women, Esther was seriously off mission. To make this worse, at this point in time, it doesn't look like there's any danger for the Jewish people. I know that later on there's going to be danger for the Jewish people. I get that. I think that as we go through the story, you're going to see that there was not danger at this point in time, and there's definitely not danger afterwards. Right? I think you'll see that that's the case. Okay? In other words, she didn't need to hide her identity, like in order to make sure that she wasn't going to get put to death or something like that. Okay? She didn't need to hide her identity. This was something that she was doing in order to gain position or popularity or whatever. Now listen, wasted opportunities are just that. But past failures do not mean that God can't use your life. And God obviously uses Esther's life. But again, that is something that is due to God and who He is. Okay? That's His grace. Well, if we get into the storyline, jump down to chapter 2, verse 23, and you'll see there, in summary, that Mordecai saves the king. That's how chapter 2 ends. Mordecai saves the king. What had happened was there was this plot to kill the king. Mordecai had heard about it, and he goes and he tells the king that it's happening, and so he saves the king. That's chapter 2:21, the end of chapter 2, okay, or 2:23. And then in chapter 3, verse 1, so the very next verse, we get, and the king honored. Now listen, if you're just reading a normal book and you see, and Mordecai saves the king, and the next sentence goes, and the king honored, who do you expect? Mordecai. And Mordecai saves the king, and the king honored Mordecai. But that's not what chapter 3, verse 1 says. Instead it says, and the king honored Haman. You're like, who the heck is Haman? We don't even know who Haman is yet at this point in the storyline. But we find out about this guy. This guy was one of the top guys in the kingdom, and the king had ordered that everyone was supposed to bow down to Haman when he passed by. But Mordecai wouldn't do it. Every time that Haman passed by, Mordecai refused to bow down. Now you might say, well, good for him. See, he's standing up for what's right. The only thing is that this was not about worship. This was about respect. And when it came to respect, the Jews were permitted to bow down. They were not allowed to worship anybody else, but they were allowed to show them respect. In fact, they do that to David. They bowed down before David. And they also do it before Elisha. They bowed down before Elisha. So we have precedent on this, that it was okay to bow down in order to show respect. It was not okay to show worship. Now listen, even if you want to disagree on that, that's okay. Later on in the story, it'll be crystal clear that this was about respect and not about worship. All right? But if it is about respect, and he's refusing to show respect, you have to ask yourself, why? Why is he refusing to show respect? Well, look at verse 1 and look at verse 10. What do you learn there about Haman in 1 and 10? He's an enemy of the Jews. Okay, we find that out in verse 10. He's an Agagite. Okay, he's an Agagite. Now listen, why tell us that twice? Why tell us that in verse 1 and verse 10? I mean, Agagite, that doesn't even sound like, that doesn't even matter. That's like one of those words you just skip over when you're reading the Bible. You don't even give that any thought. But here it is mentioned in verse 1 and in verse 10. One of the things that we realize right away is he wasn't bowing down because this man was an enemy of the Jews and he wouldn't bow down. But the fact that he's an Agagite is mentioned twice. This is called bookending in Scripture. It says, hey, pay attention to this. Okay, pay attention to what's coming. And an Agagite it probably goes back to King Saul. If you remember from the introduction that we read, this man, Mordecai, is a descendant of King Saul. Okay? Now, King Saul was at one time fighting a battle against the Amalekites. All right? And as he fought this battle, he was supposed to destroy everything. But you know what he did? He spared all kinds of things, including the king. And Samuel shows up and he's like, hey, you did what God told you to do, right? And Saul's like, oh yeah, I did it. I completed everything God told me to do. Well, then what's the bleating of sheep I hear in my ears, right? Samuel says. And it turns out, oh no, I was gonna take care of those. Those are gonna be for sacrifices and things like that, right? And then Samuel finds out, but you spared Agag, the king of the Amalekites. He spared Agag. Okay? And because he spared Agag, Samuel says, listen, for this reason, the throne is going to pass away from you. It's going to move from the tribe of Benjamin to the tribe of Judah. This is the point where the kingdom is taken out of Saul's hands by God. That determination is made. And why is it made? Because he spared Agag. Who's this guy? He's an Agagite. He's a descendant of that king. So it may have even been that there's still some hard feelings on Mordecai's part, because he would be part of the royal line if it wasn't for this guy. It wasn't this guy's fault. But now he is not. He's not even in the royal tribe anymore. All right? But whether you think that or not, you can see that he is not going to show respect to his enemy. Well, Haman is not happy about that at all, because Haman turns out to be an extremely proud man. Okay? And so he goes and he says, listen, king, you know what we ought to do? We ought to kill all the Jews, which is somewhat extreme. Okay? But then this is what ends up happening. The king's like, good idea. And so in chapter 3, 13 through 15, it says, dispatches were sent by courier to the king's province with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young, old, women, and children. Now that's extreme. Kill them all. Not just kill them, annihilate and destroy. Okay? A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province, made known to every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. So the king and Haman, they're like, this is awesome. Let's go ahead and celebrate. So they sit down, they have a drink. But the city of Susa was bewildered. What's that indicate to you? The city of Susa was bewildered. They didn't understand why. They were confused. This was strange, right? In other words, if you hated the Jews, and the king made an edict to kill all the Jews, would you sit down and drink with the king and Haman? Would you kind of do that same thing? Or would you be surprised? Right? I mean, they didn't hate the Jews. This is the point. They're going, what the heck just happened here? They're bewildered. They don't understand why you would kill, destroy, and annihilate all the Jews, men, women, and children, which gives us an indication that it wasn't a problem to be a Jew until now. Now it's a problem to be a Jew. But prior to this moment, it was not a problem to be a Jew because the city of Susa was bewildered at this decree. Now you might say, man, that seems pretty excessive. And you know, Xerxes is known for this kind of thing. We don't know a lot about Xerxes from here, but we actually have some other records of King Xerxes. One of those records show that he was a guy that was like this, where he was very unstable. You know, you had to be careful what you asked for and when you asked for it, that kind of a thing. So there's another story that's outside of the Bible that tells us that there was a man who went before Xerxes and he offered him a large gift of money just to honor Xerxes. And Xerxes saw that large gift and Xerxes said, you know what? You're such a great citizen. I wish all my citizens were like that. He said, you keep your money. In fact, I'm going to give you a percentage on top of it and you can have all that money. And the man went away. And the man came back a little bit later and King Xerxes says, what can I do for you? And the man says, listen, my son is about to be conscripted into the military, and I'm wondering, is there a way that I can pay a fee or something so that he doesn't have to go into the military? And Xerxes flew into a rage, the story goes. He ordered that the man's son be cut from head to bottom, cut him in half, lay him on both sides of the road, and then he had a parade march down through the pieces. This is what we get from history as far as what we know of Xerxes. And we see here too, he was fairly absurd, fairly excessive in the way that he acted. Well, now there's this decree to kill all the Jews. And Mordecai says, hey, Esther, I think you should go to the king and plead for our people. All right? And Esther says, no, I'm not doing it. Now, why does she say she's not going to do it? Because at this point, we are 5 years further into the story. She's been queen for 5 years. And she tells us that she has not been summoned to go before the king for 30 days. In other words, she is not occupying the king's mind. He has not asked for her for 30 days, which means he has other things that he's involved in. Okay? So, she is not anxious to go before the king. In fact, if she goes before the king, we're going to be told later that she could actually be put to death. And if you think about it, she became queen because her predecessor, Vashti, disrespected the king. The king told her to come and she wouldn't come. Now, if Esther goes, that's seen as a sign of disrespect, a sign of disrespect that is so strong that he can actually have her put to death. In fact, the penalty is death, and he's got to stay the penalty. It's the default. Okay? And so she's thinking, man, my predecessor was replaced by me because of disrespect. If I go in there, the king could replace me. It gives him the perfect excuse to find another queen. And I kind of got things going pretty good here. Yeah, I know the king hasn't called for me in 30 days, but I'm the queen. So she says, no way, I'm not doing it. Well, Esther's words were told in chapter 4, verse 12. Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, and he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you've come to your royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Right? So she knows she's risking her life. It's against the law for her to do this. And Esther goes before the king. And you know what he does? He raises his scepter, giving her a pardon. And so she's okay. She can ask. And the king says, hey, what can I do for you, Esther? And she does not ask him for what she wants. Instead, she says, hey, would you come to a party with me and Haman? I want to do a little feast with you, me, and Haman. Right? And the king's like, okay. Now, sometimes people speculate. Now, why didn't she just ask? And some people say, man, she got scared. That's probably why. I don't think so. I think she's fasted for 3 days. I think she's planned for this. I think that the reason that she doesn't ask is because she's actually incredibly intelligent. She's a very wise woman. She's been the queen for 5 years. She knows how to approach Xerxes, right? Women might know how to talk to their husbands, you know. She knows that you don't just go into Xerxes when you don't know what mood he's in and just ask him for whatever. You don't do that. You got to get him in the right mood. So she's pulling him out of that. She's getting into a dinner where she can kind of have dinner with him, get a sense for what his mental state is before she asks him. That's what I think is going on. I think she's wise, and I think that's why she does it. So they have the banquet. And the king asks her at the banquet, hey, what do you want? And you know, she says the same thing. She says, I want you to come to another banquet tomorrow with me, you, and Haman. Which again seems strange, except for if she's a wise person, she would have known this is not the night to ask the king. That's what I think. Okay? So she just knew. So she kicked the can down the road one more night to see what happens. Well, Haman has just had dinner with the king and the queen. Do you know Haman's wife wasn't even invited? It's just Haman by himself with the king and queen. I mean, you got to be really important to have a dinner by yourself with the king and queen. And not only that, they want you to come back again tomorrow night. You know? So Haman walks out. He's on cloud 9. And this is what happens. We're told in Esther 5:9, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Now this is actually shocking. Okay? First of all, you need to pick up on this, that this was not about bowing down. This is where it's very clear. Mordecai would not even stand up. Right? He's not showing respect because he won't even stand up. So even if you say, well, at the beginning, that was him just not wanting to bow down. This time, he won't even stand up. I mean, is there something wrong with standing up? You know? Just show the man some respect. In fact, the king has ordered that you do it. But what makes this even more incredible is this. It's Mordecai's fault that this edict was issued. It was because he refused to show respect to this man that was issued. And you know what? Instead of him going to Haman himself and just saying, Haman, you know what? I am so wrong. I shouldn't have done that. And trying to make it right. And you say, well, of course he wouldn't do that. Haman would have killed him on the spot. But he sends Esther in to talk to the queen. To talk to the king when that's a possible death penalty. So he's willing to send Esther to her potential death, but he's not willing to go to his potential death to try to make it right with Haman. But not only that, he's not even changing in his ways. He's still seated, will not stand up. This is unbelievable pride and stubbornness. Okay? He will not acknowledge this man's authority. And the truth is that God is the one who puts up and puts down authorities, and so he should have done that. Well, Haman goes home and he complains about this and to his wife and his friends, and they're like, why don't you just have Haman killed? Why don't you just have Mordecai killed now? So Haman's like, yeah, it's a good idea. So he stays up all night building a 75-foot pole. The translation is a little bit tricky there. It's either a pole or a gallows. We don't know. But it was something that was going to kill him. If it was a gallows, you know what that is. He was going to hang him. If it was a pole, it would have had a sharpened tip on it, raise Mordecai up and drop him on the end of that pole, right? And it's sort of like a crucifixion type death where you kind of sit up there for a while before you die, right? And so one of those things is happening. So all night long he spends building this 75-foot pole. Meanwhile, chapter 6, 1-4, that night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officials, who guarded the doorway and had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Remember, this is back in chapter 2. And it says, and Mordecai said to the king, and the king honored Haman. This was that moment. It was 5 years ago. He happens to be reading that exact account right now from 5 years ago. King Xerxes says, well, wait. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, who's in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he'd set up for him. Right? So the king can't sleep. All right? And he's going, man, read me a story. They start reading the history book to him. And he realizes that he's not honored Mordecai for saving his life. right? At that very moment, Haman has just gotten cleaned up. You know, he's taken a shower and everything. He's finished making this 75-foot pole. He's come into the outer court because remember, you can't go to the king unless you're summoned. If he goes in there without being summoned, he can be put to death. So he's standing in the outer court, waiting to be acknowledged. But it's early in the morning. You know, and so nobody else is there. And the king is like, man, we got to honor Mordecai. Who's in the court? Well, the only guy there is Haman. He's there to request that Mordecai be killed. So he gets called into the king. And the king says to him, hey, what should we do for someone that the king wants to honor? And Haman is so full of himself that he thinks it's got to be me. He's talking about me. I mean, after all, I went to dinner with the king and queen last night. I'm going to dinner with the king and queen tonight. What could be done for the one the king wants to honor? And the crazy thing is, there's a lot of irony here because the things that he says are treasonous. Except the king doesn't know he's talking about himself. So the king says, what should be done for somebody the king wants to honor? And Haman says, you know what you should do? You should get the king's royal robe and put it on him. Right? Haman's thinking about himself. That's treason. But the king doesn't know it. The king thinks he's talking about Mordecai because that's who the king's talking about. Right? So he's like, oh yeah, the king's royal robe. Good idea. What else should we do? Go get the king's royal horse. So you put the royal robe on him. You put him on the royal horse. And then you get one of your top officials and you have him lead him around the city and you say, this is what is done for someone that the king wants to honor. I mean, Haman's feeling pretty good right now. Until he hears the next words, go do it for Mordecai. All right? And at this point, his heart has to just sink, right? Oh no. Not only does he have to do this for his enemy, but think about this. He has a pole set up in his backyard to kill Mordecai. I mean, at this moment, he's not only thinking, oh man, I got to go and lead him around the city doing this, which is horrible in and of itself, but he's also thinking, I hope the king doesn't find out about that pole, because he's the top official. And what are the people going to think when he leads Mordecai around saying, this is what is done for the king, for whom the king wants to honor? At the same time, the top official built something to execute that very man in the evening. You know? I mean, the king's going to look like a tool shed. You know? This can't happen this way. Right? So instead, you know, he's thinking the whole time, I think, oh man, I hope the king doesn't find out. I hope the king doesn't find out. I hope the king doesn't find out. They go to dinner that night. All right? Before he goes to dinner, he talks to his wife, and his wife's like, oh man, you're in trouble. You know? Gets to dinner. King says, Esther, what can I do for you? And Esther says, there's somebody who wants to kill me and all my people. And the king's like, what? Who would dare do such a thing? Well, it's Haman. I'm a Jew. And he's conspired to kill all the Jewish people, right? And now the king is so angry, he runs out of the room. All right? Haman is so freaked out, he throws himself on this couch where Esther was seated. Okay? Now, there was absolutely no funny business going on here because there were attendants in the room. Right? But the king runs out. We don't really know why. He's probably wondering, what in the world am I going to do now? You know? Because remember, he's a Persian king. He can't change the decree. Just like Darius couldn't change the decree of, I don't want to throw Daniel in the lion's den. He couldn't change it. The law is above the king in Persia. So he's thinking, what am I going to do now? He's probably mad. He's probably frustrated. He's probably, upset, whatever. He comes back into the room and he sees Haman on the couch. And he says, after conspiring to kill her, now you're going to molest her, which seems really strange. Okay? But there was a rule that said that you couldn't be within 7 feet of a king's concubine. She's the queen. So if he's now thrown himself on the couch, he's probably not even touching her. Okay? But if he's thrown himself on the couch, he is way out of line. Right? And the king is already in a rage. Okay? And just that moment, the servants decide to remind the king about something. So in 7, 9, and 10, then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, a pole reaching to the height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he'd set up for Mordecai, and the king's fury subsided. These guys must not have liked Haman very much either, and so they point this out. I love how they decided to say, the one that you honored this morning, that's who he wanted to impale on that thing. And so the king puts Haman to death. Then in 8:7, in Esther 8:7, it says, King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I've given his estate to Esther, and they've impaled him on the pole he set up. So he not only takes care of Haman. He promotes Mordecai to second in command, and he gives Esther Haman's estate, which means that Esther is now not only the queen, but she's probably also now the richest woman in all of Persia, because she owns the estate of Haman, the man who was just second in command of the entire kingdom. Right? Now she's not only the queen, she's a wealthy landowner at this point, which tells you something. Okay? It tells you that the people in Persia did not have a view of women maybe like other kingdoms might have. It also tells you that there was no problem in being a Jew, because when the king finds out, he goes ahead and promotes both of them. Right? In fact, what might the story have looked like had Esther told the truth at the very beginning? If Esther had told them at the very beginning that she was a Jew, do you think there would have ever been an edict saying to wipe out all the Jews? If Esther had told them at the very beginning that she was a Jew, chapter 2 probably would have said, and Mordecai saved the king, and chapter 3 would have said, and the king honored Mordecai, and he would have elevated him to the second in command, just like he does at the end of the book. Right? There was no need to hide this. Maybe, like Nebuchadnezzar, Xerxes could have been influenced for the Lord. She didn't need to hide her identity. That's the point. She didn't need to hide her identity. The book ends with a 3-verse chapter in chapter 10. Look at that chapter and tell me how you would summarize it. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire, just in short. In all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted. Are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. How would you summarize that? It's about the greatness of Mordecai. You know, it's about the greatness of Mordecai. The book begins with the greatness of the king. The book ends with the greatness of Mordecai. There's a couple of issues with this. You remember when Daniel got the vision and he came running before? He didn't even stick himself in the middle. It's just like, listen, and the Lord has revealed to the king the dream. But here, Mordecai is the one that, where's the glory of the Lord? Where's the glory for what God has done? You know? Instead, it's the glory of Mordecai. And what's even worse is, look at what it says. It says things like, he was held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his own people and spoke up for the welfare of the Jews. Really? It's because of him they were almost wiped out. You know? I mean, that's the exact opposite of what we've seen in this story. It's easy to look back at that, the section of verses that tend to be the most popular verses in Esther, you know, maybe for this time, such a time as this, you were raised up and that kind of thing, which I think God can use those verses. But listen, what we saw about Mordecai throughout this book does not seem to suggest that he had her good at heart. It was probably much more about manipulation, okay, than anything else. But here, instead of placing the honor on God, the honor is placed on Mordecai. I think if we're reading this the way that the author intended, we should be feeling loss. We should be feeling sadness. We should be feeling sort of like we just got kicked. Okay? Now, at the same time, there's unbelievable grace. God's hand is evident throughout this whole thing, is clearly at work. I mean, Esther does get her position. She's spared before the king. Mordecai is not honored immediately, which is important, that he gets forgotten in a sense. Okay? And then 5 years later, the king just happens to not be able to sleep on the night that he'd had this banquet, that Esther had not chosen to reveal what she wanted, right? And in that very night, he hears this story, and then he decides he needs to honor Mordecai. But that same moment, Haman walks into the room, right? I mean, this is just way too much coincidence. Then it turns out that Haman gets stuck on his own gallows. He spent one night building it, he spends the next night sitting on it, you know? Mordecai becomes second in the kingdom. Esther ends up being this giant landowner. In other words, God is faithful. He just is. He's faithful to his promises. Do you know why the Jewish people weren't wiped out? Because God made a promise to Abraham way back when. The Abrahamic covenant said that they would be as numerous as the stars of the sky. The Abrahamic covenant says there's always going to be someone to sit on the throne of David. You know, these things are promised to Abraham. And as a result of that, God was not going to allow his people to get wiped out. It really wasn't because of Mordecai. It really wasn't because of Esther that they weren't wiped out. In fact, it was really a lot of ways in spite of them. They caused a lot of the problem that they got into. You know, it's easy to say, well, I made a big mess, but I cleaned it up. Should I get a button? You know, should I get a medal? You know? Listen, God is faithful. He just is. And the incredible thing is that he's faithful even when we're not. You know? That's the exciting thing. Even when we're not faithful, God will step in and still be faithful. And that's what we see. I think that the book of Esther is really about the greatness of God. Even though he's not mentioned in the book, you see him very clearly. And the fact of that stands out, because it's one thing to see God working when everybody's serving him, you know? But when nobody's paying attention to him, is he still active? Absolutely. Because his activity is not conditioned upon our activity. His faithfulness is not conditioned upon our faithfulness. God will be true to his word. You can choose to believe it or you can choose not to. And here's the difference between Esther and Daniel. Esther was used by the Lord. Daniel was used by the Lord. That's the same. The difference is one of them got to enjoy it. You know? Daniel spent his time worshiping the Lord. He really got to enjoy what God was doing. He actually was seeing what God was doing. He wasn't attributing the things that God was doing to his own successes. Mordecai and Esther did that. They missed out on what God was doing, on the enjoyment of what God was doing, and they Mordecai attributed it to his own successes. Right? The story of Esther should cause us to ask ourselves, what kind of walk with the Lord do we want? Do we want to walk with the Lord where we stand by faith on the promises that we know? Or do we want to walk like Daniel, or do we want to walk like Esther? I know that for many, or even most, you probably have not heard a negative perspective on Esther before. This is not unique to me. It's actually something that you would find in different commentaries and Bible handbooks and so forth, right? But I think it does serve to prove a point. And the point is that we tend to overlook compromise. We tend to overlook compromise. In fact, you know, in myself, it's even hard to even preach this message. I mean, I would really like to give Esther the benefit of the doubt all throughout. You know, I'm constantly trying to figure out a way to give Esther the benefit of the doubt. But if I just step back and look at it, I say, wait a second. Daniel was clearly running after righteousness. That's fighting the fight of faith. Esther was just not. She just wasn't. She's clearly not running after righteousness. That wasn't her pursuit, you know? And so she just wasn't a person who fought the fight of faith. She instead was a person of compromise. It comes down to a question of values. Are we going to flee this and run towards righteousness, holiness, godliness? What kind of life are we going to live? Daniel lived that. Esther didn't.